Hello, my name is Xander. Welcome to a Docker Compose and Django tutorial. This one's a little bit tricky to explain. I've named it How to Build and Start a Django Project with Docker Compose, so just bear with me while I try and explain this one. So by the end of this tutorial, we're going to have this type of setup. So we're going to describe in a Django Compose file how to start a Django project. We'll then build an image and then go ahead and run the Docker Compose file. And that's going to then create a new container and then start a new Django application. And the twist is here as well, we're going to link the Docker container volume, so the folder where Django is installed, we're going to mirror that across to our operating system and then have that opened in Visual Studio Code. So we're going to be working with Django as we normally do in Visual Studio Code, but anytime we make changes in Visual Studio Code, it will also update the Docker container. So that way we're going to serve the Django application within the Docker container. So you might be thinking, well, what is the point of that? I'll explain that in a short while. So just before we start the tutorial, if you are new to this series, don't forget you're going to need to have Docker and Docker Compose installed. Typically they come as one package, you install it as one. And then of course Python, a code editor. Here we're using Visual Studio Code. And then ideally you've already seen part one of this Docker Django series. So just quickly then take you through the steps here. We're going to create a new requirements list. Now again, you can just skip steps if you want to. The video timeline is in the video description. Then we're going to create a new Dockerfile. So you should be familiar with that from the first tutorial. Then we're going to build, create, describe a Docker Compose file, and then build a Docker image. And then we're going to go ahead and run the Docker Compose files. That's really the steps that we're going to take. So once we've done that, we'll spend some time at the end going through the stages of starting and stopping the Django application, building multiple Django applications from the same image, for example, as well, to get familiarized and comfortable working in this way. So you know where this is heading. In the next tutorial, we'll use this same setup but define multiple services. So here we're just going to focus on the single service using Docker Compose just to familiarize ourselves with this setup. So going back to that question, what is the point of doing this? Well, let's remember that here we're going to be running a container. A container is independent from our operating system. It's contained, all the services, software is all contained within the Docker container. And that will then prevent any conflicts or compatibility issues with our main operating system that we might have when we've had to install a database or Redis or other software within our main operating system. So here what we're doing essentially is we're describing what services we want to run in our Docker Compose file, and then we're going to run those, set them up and run those in our container. Now, because our container is running Linux, it's a consistent code base. We know that anytime we run any of these services in our container, it's just going to work. We're not going to have compatibility issues with Windows and so on. Right, so I've gone ahead and downloaded the previous code from the previous tutorial. In some respects, it doesn't really matter at this point if you've done that or not. Let me just show you first. So remember, we're not going to have a Django application to begin with. Right, so this is the previous code from the previous tutorial. So I'm just going to get rid of the core folder with all the Django files in it. Don't need that. I'm going to get rid of the database. Don't need that, and the manage py file. So all I'm left with here is a command file, which I'm just building for you so you can reference back to the commands that we've utilized. That's nothing to do with the application at all. And then we've got the Docker file from the previous tutorial and the Docker ignore file. So we can actually get rid of the Docker ignore file now. We don't need that. So that ends up with us just needing the requirements text file, which I'll just remove that. And in addition to that, the Docker file that we previously had. So that's all we're going to need to start off with. So this is where we left off in the previous tutorial. So the Docker file allows us to build, say, one service. So a single service. So the idea here with Docker Compose is that we're composing multiple services. We're describing and configuring multiple services. So we are going to use Docker file to set up our image. So we're going to need an operating system, a working directory, and copy across like we've done before the requirements text and install it. But we're not going to need to copy anything over again. So we don't need to worry about that. And then we're going to configure all of these other settings in our Docker Compose file. So let's get rid of the command there, and we can squeeze all this up, and that's pretty much it that we're going to need there. So there is one additional setting here, and that's the Python unbuffered equals 1. So we're going to set this to a non-empty value. So basically this is going to ensure that any Python output is sent straight to the terminal. So any error logs, for example, is going to be sent straight to the terminal, which is in this case our container log. So what that essentially means is whenever, for example, let's give you an example of an error. When there's an error, that error will then go to the command line. So you can see the error. That information will get piped to the command line, so you can see, or the terminal, sorry. So what might happen is that data might first get buffered, and when there's enough of that data, it then will get forwarded to your terminal. So the idea here is that we're going to set this unbuffered to 1, and we're going to say any data is just going to be sent directly to the terminal without being buffered, without being stored, maybe to a certain size limit before sending across. So it just allows us to work in real time, essentially. We get the messages straight away. Okay, so now we need to build a Docker Compose file. And this is essentially just a YAML file, which is, if you've not used YAML before, it's going to look like a text file, a human readable text file. YAML is a data serialization language. So all we really need to know is that we need a YAML file. So we're going to need a .yml extension to this, and we're just going to describe in clear text really what's going on. So by all means have a look at YAML files or the YAML syntax if you want to learn more about that. Right, so let's crack out a new file here. Docker-compose YML. There we go. So welcome to Docker Compose. This is where we're going to start here. Now, the first thing to understand about Docker Compose, there's different compose specifications, and that's pretty much all we need to know. Just make sure that you're potentially using the latest specifications. So here, loosely speaking, in different specifications, there may be different ways of describing or performing different actions. So you can see we started from 1.0. Here it looks like we're up to 3.8. So the first item in our Docker Compose file normally consists of what version that we're working in. So here we could just say version 3, for example, if we want to, or be more specific, 3.8. So back when I described what Docker Compose is for, just to reiterate again, here we're building or defining services that we want to run in our container. So you would imagine at this point, this command will make sense. We're now going to describe our services that we want to run. So here in this tutorial, we are going to only be running one service. In the next tutorial, we'll run multiple databases. I wanted to make that into a separate tutorial because I wanted to show you multiple setups. So this makes sense, hopefully now. We've got a service that we want to describe. So we want to build an application. We could call this Django. I'm just going to call this app. So that's the name of our application. So I'm now going to indent further and start defining this application and how I want to build it. So next up is build. So this is a powerful tool which we can utilize to configure other options that are applied at build time. So next up, we're going to describe the build. So here we could define multiple options or configuration options that we would then want to apply at build time. Here we're just going to specify the dot. So the dot here refers to this folder here, and you can see that we've got our Dockerfile inside of this folder. So now we could just describe this as we're just telling the build that the Dockerfile exists, and we can utilize that to support the build. So next up, we're going to define a volume. So before we do that, let's go back into the Dockerfile. Let's make our working directory called Django. So I'm just going to change the working directory to Django. Hopefully that just gives us a little bit more context to understand this. So a volume here in this context is describing a folder that resides on our operating system within the container. Right, so what we want to do here is by utilizing volumes, we're going to set up using dot. So dot referring to this folder here, our project folder, and then we're going to match that, or we're going to copy that, mirror that, or make a link between the containers folder, and that's the /Django folder. That's what I've just set up here. So when we're going to install everything inside of this Django folder in the container. Remember, the container is running an operating system, so we're going to build a new folder called Django, and then put Django application within this folder. So we're going to basically just copy this folder. So dot is referring to my machine here, this folder here. If I wanted a different folder or make a new folder, I could change the structure here to that. So if I had a folder ASD over here, I could mirror it across to there. So colon, and then the folder that's on the container, or in the container, in this case /Django. So that's going to build my link between the folders and my folder that's going to be on the computer. Now remember, what's going to happen here is that initially when the application is built, a new folder will appear. I can go ahead and do whatever I want in this folder. That is saved on my computer. That's the important thing, is that it's saved on my computer. When I close or delete the container, everything is saved still on my computer. And I can just then build a new container, update the data before I build a new container. In actual fact, I'm going to show you this, and then it will just work as normal again. So that builds that link. So we're going to need some ports. So if you remember from the first tutorial, we're going to map across the ports so we can access the container. So port 8000 on our computer to port 8000 in the container here. So that's going to expose the 8000 port in the container so that we can link into our Django application using the 8000 port. And now we just go ahead and we can name the image or give the name a tag. So we say image. So the image is going to be called app because we've got app here. So we want to rename or tag this image. So we're going to just tag this image as Django, and we can then run the image with the tag, which is going to be Django. So you can change that if you want to. So I've just called that Django, and then we can then go ahead and actually name the container. So the container that's made from this, we can name this. So I'm just going to call this Django container, so you can see that in place. And then the final command, so we want to run a command now. So where previously we run a command, so in contrast here, we can do this without all the double quotes. So just run the command Python and then manage.py. We're just going to start Django, run server. And then like we did previously, 0.0.0.0 to expose on the container all IP addresses, and then the port number 8000. So this is tricky to explain here, why 000 and not 127, etc. So like I said, 0000 in networking terms, 0 represents something a little bit special, and here we're saying to represent all IP address from this service and expose all of them over to port 8000. So definitely head over to the Docker docs and select the command line references and then the Docker Compose reference over here. Here you can find all the main commands that you can utilize in Docker Compose. Now to build an image here, if you remember Docker, we just use Docker build, and then maybe we can tag it like we did in the first tutorial. So here we've also got Docker Compose build. Now to build an image in Docker Compose, there is a few commands that we could use. So we could use build, or we could in actual fact use run to build an image. Now I'll start off just using the Docker build, or Docker Compose build. So let's go back in and run Docker Compose build. So here we're just going to create an image and prepare it for then to run our Docker Compose file. So if we go back into our Docker desktop here, you can see that we've got now a new image that's created. We've got the tag as we've described in our Docker Compose file. So that's all in place. Now we are using a slim version of Linux. That's probably worth noting. So there's no container running at the moment. So we've just got our image. So what we can now do from this, if we wanted to, is run a second command. So next up then, we're going to run docker compose run. So like I said, the run can actually build for us as well and just do the whole thing. But I just wanted to show you the fact that you could docker compose build if you wanted to do that, and have a look at the docs and the comparison between the build and the run command, because they do slightly different things. With the run, there's more parameters that we can provide, and we'll go through that right now, or at least some of them. So docker compose and then run. Right, so I'm going to use the RM. So docker run compose run is going to build a container for us, but I don't want it to do that initially, because I want to start the container separately, because I want to potentially perform some other actions before I run the container. So I'm going to remove the container once everything's run, and then basically I'm going to select what I want to, the image that I want to use. So that's going to be the app image. So that's my app image. And what I want to do here is I want to run a command. So using compose run, it's going to allow us to run a one-time command. So if you remember what's happening here in our compose file, at the end, it's going to run the server. Now at the moment, we don't have a Django application. We don't have any volumes. Notice we built the image, but we don't have a volume yet at all. And this is only going to appear and start once we've actually built the container. So these are commands for essentially the container. So here we're going to select the app image that we built, and now we're going to define a command that we want to run before we then go ahead and actually start to run the server. And that's obviously to build a Django application. So Django admin, start project, and then the project's going to be called core, and like I normally do, a dot at the end to specify I want to run it from the folder and not a folder within a folder. Right, so let's go ahead and do that. So that might take a couple of seconds. Okay, so what's the result of that? Well, it looks like absolutely nothing at the moment because I've stopped the container. But if, for example, now I go back into Visual Studio Code here, you can see that this has run, because you can now see I've got a folder called core. I've generated a new Django application, and here I've got my managed file, and I've got my core folder. So everything is started. So what I can now do is just show you the next command, and that is docker compose up. So that's basically going to start the container. You can see that it's now running. Now we are locked in here to the container. So this is the terminal. What you're looking at here is the commands that have been captured from our container terminal, and they're showing them here. So you may be familiar with this, our unapplied migrations, because this is a new project and we haven't migrated yet. So it looks like it's running okay. So obviously the last check we can do is go into our server, and there we go. So let's not forget we binded the port 8000 to our Django container. So now what you're looking at here is Django running inside of our container. So if we go over to Docker desktop, go into our containers, you can see that F is running, and you can see the Django container is called Django container because that's what we specified. So where does this F come from? Well, F here is the name of my folder that's holding all of these files. That's why it's called F. So what you built now, in actual fact, is a based image. This image here is a base image you can now use to run multiple Django applications if you want to. So let's do that right now. So let's just open up a new window. It's going to be quite large, I do apologize. So let's just slim this down a little bit. So we're just going to go ahead and create a new project. So I'll build a new folder and I'll start that up and I'll see you in a second. Okay, so I've made a new folder. I've just copied and pasted the Django compose file that we built earlier and the Dockerfile over to my new project folder called G. And that's pretty much what I need here. So I've got my image already made. So there's one change that I need to make. I can't run a container on the same port as another container. for obvious reasons. I can only connect to one. I can only connect to one port at a time with one application. So I've changed that to 8001 this time. Nothing else has been changed. So let's go ahead now and run the same command again. So docker compose run rm app Django admin start project core. Right, so let's go ahead and, well, actually, yeah, let's go ahead and do this first, because what we want to do is we want to make a new project called core and get a new folder. So let's go ahead and do this. So you can see that's run okay. I've got my new Django project right here, and now I can use compose. So docker compose up and then start my new container. Okay, so there seems to be a bit of conflict. You have removed, oh, so it looks like we've got a naming problem. So we've already got a container called Django underscore container. So let's call this number 2. There we go. So now it's working okay. Let's go back into here. So we didn't make a new image. We're using the same image. We go into the containers. I've got 2 containers now, one called G, one called F. And inside of here, there we go. We've got these different services. So let's go back into here. We're going to go to 8001 now. And we're going to see that we've got another Django application. So now we've got everything set up. I'm just going to get rid of this G for now. So let's go back to the F, the first build. So now we've got that. I'm just going to go ahead and delete. So I'm in, apologies, you can't see this. I can't move this down any smaller. So I'm just going to stop on the right hand side. I'm going to select the container. On the right hand side, I'm going to delete the container on both, or the services in the container. So that gets rid of the containers. And then I'm going to keep the image there. I don't want to move that. So what I want to do now, I've got my application here. I can run my application right here if I wanted to, like I normally do. So I can work within a container or not. So I run that and it's working exactly the same, and I can view it exactly the same, right? Because the Docker compose file and the Dockerfile isn't affecting my application running. It isn't dependent upon my application running here locally. So what I can also do now is I'm just going to grab the files from the first tutorial and I'm going to drop them in here and update them. Bear with me 1 second. So I'm going to go ahead and just update the URLs. So that was from the first tutorial. Apologies, let's get rid of this. So I created import views and I created a new path for the home, and then I'm creating a template. Again, this is just the code from the first tutorial. So that's what it said, hello. And then I also had a view, a simple view that connected up my template. So obviously at this point, I've made some changes to my project, right? That's what I wanted to show. So all I need to do now is Docker compose up again. Okay, so you can see that everything has been retained. But now when I go over to my project, this is 8001, sorry, 0. It says template does not exist. Okay, bear with me a second. That is because I need to just register the core app within the settings. That's something I need to do manually. Okay, and then go back to and refresh. And there we go. So we're now serving again our project from Docker. We've mirrored across all the data to Docker, and you can see it's working. So we now have Django being served again from Docker. So if you go into Docker Desktop, for example, and select your container on the right hand side here, if you drop this down, sorry, actually we can do it from here. So if you drop this down, you can see our container. We can select the CLI. So that would take us directly into our container. Now remember, our container is running an operating system of a small version or a slim version of, Linux. So we can run Linux commands. So ls for list. So this is the working directory that we're working in currently, and you can see all the files here. So if I type in cd then /, that will take me back to the root directory and press ls to list all the items. So you can see our folder called Django, and then I can cd into that folder again, and then I'm inside of that folder again. So here I can actually inspect all the files. So if I just go into change directory and then core, and then list them, you can see here we've got our views. That's been copied across and mirrored across from our Django application that we have stored on our computer that we were working in with Visual Studio Code. So you can see that, yeah, it's actually happened. It's actually mirrored across all the data over to the template, or over to the container. Okay, hopefully I don't need to embellish any further. You probably got it at this point what's going on. So have a go, have a play, and see how you get on. And like I said, in the next tutorial, we will extend the services in our Docker Compose file to include databases. So I do want to install maybe a few different databases to give you some understanding of how to set up multiple databases in Docker Compose with Django. And there we have it. Thank you very much for listening. Hopefully that was useful. If you do like that, please like and subscribe and do those things. And hopefully I'll see you in the next tutorial.